Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Jason Morgan had never been a stranger to chaos, but the Five Poppies compound was unlike any battleground he had ever walked into. The place reeked of secrecy and menace, a labyrinth designed to trap intruders with layers of deception and violence. From the moment he realized Britt Westbourne would not abandon her post despite his desperate pleas, he understood that his mission had just escalated to a far more treacherous scale. Her refusal was not born of pride or stubbornness alone, but from the grim reality that her research and the medications tied to it could not be simply abandoned without consequences. Yet even as Jason wrestled with the frustration of not being able to protect her in the straightforward way he desired, fate hurled him into a darker mission. Jocelyn, Jax and Vaughn were in imminent peril, and he had no choice but to put everything on the line to save them. The warning signs began with Jocelyn's unease upon returning to her room, only to discover Vaughn missing. The silence of the space was suffocating, and before she could make sense of the absence, Pascal emerged from the shadows, his weapon gleaming cold under the dim light. His promises of a reunion with Vaughn were laced with malice, a lure designed to draw Joss into captivity. What she did not yet know was that Vaughn had already been targeted by an assassin, his death meant to be swift and silent. The fact that Vaughn was still breathing at all was nothing short of miraculous, a stroke of luck owed entirely to Jocelyn's quick thinking and frantic resistance. Yet miracles do not last forever, and Jason's sudden arrival marked the critical shift. He saw at once that this was not simply about saving Joss, not only about keeping Carly's daughter alive, but also about preventing Vaughn's execution and dismantling a threat that reached far beyond the compound's walls. Jason's instincts screamed at him to act fast, but Five Poppies was built to break men like him, fortified corridors, hidden chambers, deadly traps concealed in the architecture itself. This was no ordinary extraction, it was a fortress of nightmares. His plan to infiltrate Vaughn's holding area demanded more than brute strength and tactical brilliance. It required another kind of ally, one who could think differently, adapt in ways he could not. That ally was Britt, though her commitment came at the end of a personal war raging inside her. Torn between clinging to her fragile safety or facing the kind of danger she had always tried to avoid, she made the choice that would alter everything. She chose to fight alongside Jason, not as a victim clinging to his shadow, but as an equal stepping into the same fire. Her medical expertise proved invaluable from the very first steps they took together. The corridors were not simply guarded by men with guns, but by layers of toxins, engineered traps, and biological deterrents that would have incapacitated anyone unprepared. Where Jason's strength and precision allowed them to navigate the physical dangers, Britt's knowledge allowed them to anticipate invisible ones, air too thick with chemical residue, vents releasing faint streams of paralyzing gas, triggers hidden in the walls. She guided him through with steady instructions, transforming herself into a second pair of eyes, a mind sharp enough to see the patterns behind the chaos. The synergy between them was undeniable, Jason moving with lethal grace while Britt's voice, steady even in terror, cut through the suffocating tension, grounding the mission in logic and awareness. With each step deeper into the compound, the stakes grew heavier. The air itself seemed to tighten around them, every creak of the floor a reminder that one mistake could cost them everything. Jason had long since accepted that death was always just an arm's reach away, but seeing Britt beside him, knowing she could have walked away yet chose to dive headlong into danger, stirred something heavier within him. It was not merely responsibility, it was a dawning realization that her bravery was equal to his own, though painted in a different shade. And as they advanced toward Vaughn's prison, Jason understood that their fates were now woven together, tethered by choice, necessity, and the unspoken knowledge that not all of them might walk away from what lay ahead. Jason did not slow once the corridor behind them filled with smoke and heat. Instinct guided each step, a hardwired rhythm that kept him moving when thought wanted to splinter apart. Vaughn's weight leaned against his shoulder in short, staggering intervals that told him the man's leg would hold only as long as the adrenaline did. Jocelyn's breath came in shallow bursts, the kind that flutter when shock is still deciding whether to clamp down or pass by. They slipped through a maintenance hatch half-welded shut from age and corrosion, then into a service tunnel that stank of damp concrete and old wiring. The alarms dulled to a distant fever as the compound breathed in smoke and exhaled panicked orders over a scrambled intercom. Every few strides, the floor shivered with a late aftershock from the blast, as if the building itself were trying to shrug off the wound Britt had given it. The tunnel sloped toward a filtration chamber that fed a blackwater canal along the edge of the property. Jason scanned the grate, calculated the angle of the bolts, and shouldered through. Vaughn slid after him, gritting his teeth without a sound, while Jocelyn lowered herself carefully, palms stinging as she caught the rough metal. The canal moved like a slow vein, carrying the heat of the compound away from the blaze. Jason waded in first, the water cold enough to bite, and guided them along the shadow of a retaining wall until the emergency floodlights dissolved into fog. When they finally hauled themselves onto a narrow bank, the night hit them with a chill that made the loss behind them ache sharper. There was no triumph in the escape, only the thin steadiness of survival and the hollow space where a brave life had just burned out to buy their passage. They regrouped beneath a line of stunted cypresses that twisted against the wind like old sentinels. Vaughn's leg wound pulsed through the improvised bandage he had cinched earlier, and his breath took on the ragged cadence of pain ignoring good sense. Jason field dressed the injury with calm precision, the movements practiced, almost ritual. Jocelyn sat a few feet away with her knees pulled close, eyes fixed on the dark horizon where the compound's glow flashed and dimmed like a storm trapped on the ground. The guilt arrived in waves. First as a tremor in her hands, then a tightness spreading through her chest, then a flood of images she could not unsee. The assassin in the hull. The sharp, sterile smell of the canisters when Britt ran. The flash that erased everything and replaced it with silence. Jason registered all of it without commentary, his presence held the space steady while her mind tried to land somewhere solid. The extraction plan shifted on the fly. The original rendezvous was compromised the second the alarms went live, and it would take hours for WSB support to draw a perimeter wide enough to choke off escape routes without exposing the entire operation. Jason selected a fallback site deep in the mangroves, where the roots wove a lattice over shallow water and ground cover muffled the sound of movement. They moved in careful segments, every pause used to listen for tracking drones or the belly thrum of approaching vehicles. Twice, distant searchlights combed over the tree line like curious eyes, but the angles were wrong and the fog decided to be kind. When a low, unmarked skimmer finally skimmed into view just before dawn, Jason signaled with a hand he kept unnaturally steady, and the pilot brought the craft in with the discretion of someone who valued a long life. On board, the world contracted to the immediate: body temperature, blood loss, respiration, hydration. Vaughn slipped into a guarded half-sleep once the analgesics took hold. Jocelyn drank water in small, disciplined sips while a thermal blanket drew the shivering out of her bones. Only when the skimmer leveled out and the pilot offered a gloved nod did Jason allow himself to meet the absence beside him. He took inventory of what remained: 3 lives, shell-shocked but intact, a mission technically completed, a conspiracy dented, not dismantled. Against that ledger, one name glowed with a clarity that tore at him. Britt had been the difference between a recovery and a massacre. In choosing the violent geometry of that hallway, she had redrawn the map of what was possible for the rest of them. The safe clinic was buried behind an old marina where the docks never hosted boats and the windows never reflected anything but cloud. The debrief began before anyone used the word debrief. A medic with battlefield quiet checked Jocelyn for concussion and microfractures. Another excavated shrapnel from Vaughn's calf with patient hands that never wavered. Jason submitted to the same routine, though his wounds were the kind that didn't bleed. A coordinator arrived with encrypted tablets and a face that had forgotten how to signal comfort years ago. The questions were brisk, layered, and relentless, moving from timelines to floor plans to the peculiarities of the air currents in the southern wing. Jason answered with the same objectivity he used to steady a breathing rhythm, but every time the narrative reached the moment Britt ran, a hesitation rippled under the words. Evidence trickled in from other teams who had been working the periphery. The blast had crippled a private data store wired into the compound's air handling system, an engineering choice that was elegant from a security perspective and catastrophic once the chemicals ignited. Before the fire suppression systems failed, a cluster of files had auto-synced to an off-site relay. The recovered fragments hinted at a broader scaffolding, shell companies layered like sediment, procurement lists that read like they were curated for sanctioned regimes, research directives written in a tone that disguised menace as medicine. Britt's lab access had made her privy to more than anyone realized. It became clear she had not only understood the trap but had chosen to break the lock in a way that would shake the whole structure, even if it took her with it. Jocelyn slept in uneven spells that left her more tired than before. When she could not close her eyes, she paced the clinic's narrow courtyard, counting tiles until the numbers softened the edges of memory. Survivors often reached for rituals, and the counting kept terror from staining every minute. Vaughn woke fully on the second day with a steadiness that surprised him. Pain had a way of focusing the mind, and his guilt arranged itself into tasks, line-by-line reports, identifications from hazy recollections, cross-referencing faces with the partial personnel files the team salvaged. The work steadied him too, though it did not absolve. In quiet intervals, he pressed his palms over his eyes until the hallway scene receded behind the dull throb in his skull. Jason moved through the clinic like a hinge, opening and closing doors between grief and duty, between the past hour and the next step. When the coordinator pushed for a formal statement on the casualty in the corridor, he provided it with clinical precision that made even the coordinator pause. There would be a memorial later, perhaps nothing more than a plaque in a room where only a handful of people were allowed to enter, or a name etched into a ledger encrypted behind layers of clearance. Jason did not measure loss by ceremony. He measured it by impact, by what changed because someone decided to stand in a place no one else could stand. Britt had recalibrated the mission's outcome, but more than that, she had altered the gravity inside the people she left behind. The investigation pressed outward as the days stacked, each new piece of intel adjusting the shape of the enemy. Pascal had been a node, dangerous but replaceable, the kind of mid-tier operator trained to be memorable enough to terrify and forgettable enough to abandon. Above him, patterns hinted at a strategist who preferred lateral moves and redundant fail-safes. The Five Poppies brand, luxury veneer over covert logistics, fractured under scrutiny to reveal a lattice of contracts feeding material to places where oversight struggled to see. Britt's notes, recovered from a cached archive the blast hadn't incinerated, showed she had mapped the pressure points weeks earlier. In blocky, concise annotations, she had flagged ventilation pathways that doubled as data conduits, storage rooms that doubled as staging points, and a series of reagent orders that did not match the declared research sequence. She had not only seen the trap, she had chosen the exact point where her act would echo far beyond the corridor. The echo reached Port Charles with delays and distortions, because news that involved shadows traveled at the mercy of those shadows. Rumors found their way into rooms where people waited for official words that would never be fully official. Carly felt a change in the air around Jason even before he said anything, because absence altered the way he held a room. Jocelyn returned with a posture that belonged to someone older, the kind of composure that only arrives when the world has shown teeth. She carried the aftermath in habits no one would notice at a glance. The way she stood with her back to a wall in crowded places, the measured inhale before stepping into bright light, the careful scan of exits mastered by instinct rather than training. Healing would not be a straight line, it would move like a tide, strong some days, receding others, always pulling back toward a horizon where fear and strength traded places. WSB leadership convened a closed review that did not pretend to be impartial. Some wanted to call the mission compromised beyond salvage, a violation of procedural orthodoxy that demanded sacrifice only within sanctioned parameters. Others saw the data trove and the damage to the enemy's infrastructure as an inflection point that justified every deviation. Jason listened without letting any of it alter the math he had done the moment the alarms began. Survival, intelligence retrieval, disruption of the network, protection of the innocent. The sequence had not been tidy, but it had held under duress because someone transformed the corridor into a decision they could not escape. Vaughn spoke once, slow and exact, describing the geometry of that hallway and the impossible angle at which they might have emerged without Britt's intervention. After that, even the loudest critics lowered their eyes to the dossiers and found other metrics to interrogate. In the weeks that followed, Jason built a quiet architecture around the absence. He mapped leads with a care that bordered on ascetic, pruning anything that smelled like vengeance for vengeance's sake and leaving only what would cut strategically. Each thread traced back to procurement hubs that laundered their inventory through humanitarian fronts. Each hub hid a spine of people who had never seen a lab or a weapons cache, accountants and brokers and freight coordinators who would swear they moved only paper and containers. The strategist behind Pascal had counted on that camouflage to slow any response. Britt's blast had knocked a hole in that calculus, and Jason intended to widen it until light reached places designed for dark. Jocelyn found purpose in smaller orbits that still mattered. She sat with families at the hospital when they needed someone steady and calm. She took shifts at a community clinic where the waiting room always overflowed and the coffee never tasted like coffee. No one asked about 5 poppies there, and the absence of questions allowed the mind to rest. At night, the bad hours still arrived, punctual as a clock, but the intervals softened as she gathered proof that life could be more than a replay of the same corridor. Vaughn recovered faster than he allowed himself to expect, then slower than he wanted, because bodies and minds rarely keep the same pace. He started training again on an empty pier at dawn, walking the line between pushing and punishing, learning where the boundary was so he would not cross it by accident. One evening, when the marina threw long bars of shadow across the clinic wall, a tech slid a drive across to Jason with the caution of someone handling memory that might explode. The cache contained secondary logs from Britt's workbench, autosaved to a cloud mirror she had configured with a paranoid elegance that only comes from surviving too many compromises. There was no letter, no last message. Britt had not been a person who rehearsed farewells. What existed instead were choices recorded in small, precise actions. Times stamped at odd hours when she had adjusted protocols to scrub identifying markers from samples that might have been used to trace unwilling subjects. Notations where she had quietly redirected a shipment from one holding site to another that doubled as a whistle for anyone looking closely. The log was a map of quiet resistance, courage distributed across dozens of decisions that required no audience. Jason closed the drive and carried the shape of those choices with him into the night. The path forward had fewer edges now because the center was clear. The network would be dismantled methodically, not with showy strikes that allowed successors to grow from the rubble, but with careful subtractions that starved the machine until it could no longer pretend to be anything else. There would be operations, and each would carry risk, because risk was the native language of the life he lived. But where before the work had been a series of tasks, now it was a promise layered under every step. A promise to the woman who had understood the corridor and chosen to become the turning point inside it. In time, a small memorial did appear, tucked behind a locked door in a building that looked like it had always been there. It was not the kind of space where flowers made sense or where words could turn into comfort. It held a list of names and the dates when the world took something it had not earned. People came rarely and alone, more often at odd hours than during the day. Jason stood there once, not to ask for anything and not to offer anything, but simply to acknowledge that the ledger had been updated and that a debt had been recorded he did not intend to leave unpaid. He stayed only long enough to be sure the memory would remain steady without his presence to anchor it. What followed did not look like revenge from the outside. It looked like paperwork delayed until a shipment missed a window and a buyer looked elsewhere. It looked like a customs inspection that chose the right container for once. It looked like a research grant that failed in committee not because of politics but because a reviewer finally saw the pattern in the footnotes. It looked like small failures accumulating into a collapse that no one could attribute to a single cause. Jason moved through these currents with a patience that would have surprised anyone who only knew him by the speed of his hands in a fight. The corridor taught him that wild courage is sometimes a quiet thing, and that finishing what someone started can be louder than a blaze if you do it right. Jocelyn's nightmares did not disappear, they transformed. The faceless gunman acquired faces she could place in files and reports. The sound of alarms fused with the beeping of monitors in a clinic where children laughed between coughs.